The wagon rolled slowly down the main street, its wheels groaning as if they, too, protested what they were being forced to carry. Dust rose in choking clouds, clinging to sweat, blood, and torn fabric. At the end of a thick hemp rope dragged a young woman, her wrists bound, her knees scraping raw against the hard-packed earth. Every jolt of the wagon yanked her forward, stealing what little breath she had left, yet the driver never looked back. Her name had already been stripped from her. To the town, she was no longer a woman but a warning. Storefront doors stood open, but no one stepped out to stop it. Men leaned against posts, hats pulled low, eyes averted. Women clutched their shawls tighter, some whispering prayers, others whispering rumors. "Thief," one muttered. "Got what she deserved," said another, though her voice trembled. Children were dragged indoors by uneasy mothers, yet a few watched through cracked windows, learning too young how cruelty could wear the mask of justice. The woman's dress, once pale blue, was now brown with dirt and dark with blood. One shoe was gone, torn away somewhere along the road. Her hair, tangled and streaked with dust, fell across her face, hiding eyes that still burned with awareness. She had stopped screaming long ago. Screams required hope, and hope had been beaten out of her at the edge of town when they tied the rope. Every step scraped memory loose. She remembered standing in the sheriff's office, hands shaking, insisting she was innocent. She remembered laughter instead of answers, hands pushing her forward, someone spitting at her feet. She remembered the rope tightening around her wrist and the way the crowd suddenly seemed very far away, as if she were already leaving the world of the living. The sign at the center of town creaked as the wagon passed beneath it. A few men laughed nervously, trying to convince themselves this was necessary, that order demanded a sacrifice. No trial had been held. No proof offered. In this town, accusation was enough when spoken by the right man. Her knees finally buckled, and she was dragged fully onto her side. Stones cut into her ribs, her shoulder screaming in pain as her body bounced helplessly behind the wagon. Still, she clung to consciousness. Somewhere deep inside, stubborn and unbroken, a small voice refused to let go. If she lived, she would remember every face that turned away. At the far end of the street, near the water trough, a shadow stretched across the road, tall, wide, unmoving. The wagon driver glanced up, irritation flashing across his face as he slowed. He had expected fear or obedience, not an obstacle. The woman barely noticed at first. Her world had narrowed to dust and pain and the rhythm of the rope burning her skin. But then the wagon stopped. Silence fell heavy, unnatural. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She lifted her head with effort, blinking through dirt and tears. Through the haze she saw boots planted firmly in the road, inches from the rope. Large boots, worn boots. The kind that belonged to a man who didn't move unless he chose to. For the first time since the rope had tightened around her wrist, something unfamiliar stirred in her chest. Not relief. Not safety. But the fragile, dangerous possibility that anyone had finally decided to see her as human again. The man at the water trough had not planned on staying in town that day. He had come for supplies, flour, coffee, a length of new tack, and nothing more. Towns brought trouble, and trouble brought memories he worked hard to keep buried. He stood apart from the boardwalk, one massive hand resting on the edge of the trough as his horse drank, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the dirt road. The brim of his hat sat low, hiding eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. He heard the wagon before he saw it. At first it was only the sound, the slow, uneven creak of wheels, the muffled murmur of voices that carried an ugly tone. Then came the dust, rising thicker than any ordinary pass-through. When he looked up, his gaze followed the rope trailing behind the wagon. And then he saw her. The cowboy's jaw tightened. Something old and violent stirred in his chest, something he had spent years locking away on his lonely stretch of land beyond the hills. He had seen men dragged before. He had done dragging himself once upon a darker time, but this was different. This was a woman, bruised, bleeding, barely conscious. The horse at the trough snorted uneasily, sensing the shift in its master. The cowboy laid a calming hand on its neck, though his own pulse thundered. Around him, townsfolk pretended not to notice his reaction. They knew him, everyone did, at least by reputation. The giant rancher from the North Valley. Quiet. Dangerous when crossed. A man who kept to himself and paid in cash. The wagon rolled closer. Close enough now that he could see the way the rope cut into her wrist, raw and red. Close enough to see her chest still rising, shallow but stubborn. The driver laughed at something someone said. Cracking a joke like this was entertainment instead of execution. The cowboy's fingers curled. He told himself to stay out of it. This wasn't his town. Wasn't his fight. Intervening meant questions, maybe gunfire, maybe the law coming down on him. He had survived by staying invisible, by riding past other people's sins and letting the world burn where it chose. But then her head lifted, just slightly, just enough. Their eyes met. Hers were dull with pain, but there was no begging in them. No plea, only a quiet, devastating awareness, as if she already knew how this would end and was simply marking the moment. That look hit him harder than any scream could have. He remembered another road, another body in the dirt, another time when he had chosen not to step in and had lived with the weight of that choice ever since. The wagon reached him and slowed. The driver frowned. "Move," he snapped, flicking the reins. Town business. The cowboy didn't answer. He stepped forward instead, planting himself squarely in the road. The rope brushed against his boot. He looked down at it, then back at the driver. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the knife at his belt. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Men shifted their weight. Hands hovered near holsters but didn't quite commit. No one wanted to be the first to challenge a man built like a bear and standing that calm. "You don't want to do this," the driver said, though his voice lacked conviction. The cowboy finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, and carried farther than shouting ever could. "You stop dragging her," he said. "Right now." The woman watched through blurred vision as the stranger loomed above her, blocking the sun. She didn't know his name. Didn't know his past. All she knew was that the rope had gone slack. And for the first time since the wagon started moving, the road beneath her stopped pulling her toward death. Before the rope burned her skin and the dust filled her mouth, there had been a kitchen. It was small, warm, and smelled of fresh bread, one of the few places in town where she had ever felt safe. She had been scrubbing a pan at the wash basin when the door opened without a knock. He walked in like he owned the space, like everything in town bent naturally to his will. Elias Crow. He wore authority the way other men wore coats casually, without thought. His vest was clean, his boots polished, his smile practiced. He had funded half the buildings on Main Street and reminded people of it whenever they forgot. The sheriff shook his hand. The preacher lowered his eyes. And women were expected to be grateful for his attention. She wasn't. "Pretty thing like you shouldn't be working your hands raw," he said, leaning against the table, watching her from behind. His voice was smooth, confident, certain of the outcome. "I could make things easier for you." She had straightened, keeping her back to him. "I'm doing just fine, sir." That was her first mistake, using sir instead of something softer. His smile tightened. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey beneath his cologne. When his hand reached for her waist, she moved away sharply, knocking the pan to the floor. "Don't," she said. Her voice shook, but she meant it. The room went cold. No man in town refused Elias Crow, and no woman ever embarrassed him. His eyes hardened, and the charm dropped away like a discarded mask. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "People like me don't take kindly to ingratitude." That night, the lie was born. By morning, The rumor had spread faster than fire through dry grass. Money missing, a valuable item gone, and her name whispered in the same breath. She had been seen near the office. She had been alone. She had no family to defend her character. In a town that ran on fear and favors, truth never stood a chance. When the sheriff came for her, she laughed at first, sure it was a mistake. Then she saw his face, not angry, not doubtful, just resigned, as if her guilt had already been decided somewhere far above her. They didn't search for proof. They didn't ask questions. Elias Crow stood nearby, watching, his expression grave, almost regretful, a performance for the crowd. A warning to anyone else who might think refusal was an option. She tried to speak, to explain, to tell them what he had done, what he had threatened. Her words died under the weight of his reputation. A woman's voice meant little against a powerful man's purse. By noon, the punishment had been agreed upon not in court, but in low voices behind closed doors. Drag her through town. Make an example. Let fear do the rest. As they tied the rope around her wrist, she realized the truth too late. This was never about theft. It was about obedience. As the wagon lurched forward and the crowd gathered, Elias Crow watched from the shade, satisfied. His lie had worked perfectly. And no one at all had spoken up for her. No one, that is, until a giant cowboy stepped into the road. The knife flashed once in the sunlight. For a heartbeat, no one seemed to understand what they were seeing. The wagon had stopped, the rope slackened, and the giant cowboy stood in the road with his blade drawn, not raised in threat, not shaking with anger, but steady, deliberate, final. Then the rope fell. It dropped into the dust with a soft, useless thud, as if it had never held a life at all. Silence swept through the street, deep and absolute. The murmurs died. The laughter vanished. Even the horses shifted uneasily, sensing the change. The woman lay still where she had been dragged, her wrist free for the first time since the edge of town, her fingers curling weakly as if testing whether she was truly no longer bound. The wagon driver stared at the severed rope, then at the cowboy. His face flushed red. "You've got no right," he began, but the words dissolved when the cowboy lifted his eyes. They were calm, too calm. The cowboy wiped the blade on his pant leg and slid it back into its sheath. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't shout. He simply stepped closer to the wagon, his height forcing the driver to crane his neck. "Get down," the cowboy said. The command carried no threat, yet it left no room for refusal. Around them, men shifted their feet. A few hands hovered near holsters, but no one drew. They had all seen men like this before, men who didn't need to prove they could kill. Men who already had. The driver swallowed hard and climbed down from the wagon, backing away. The reins slipped from his fingers, forgotten. The woman tried to move, pain lancing through her body like fire. She gasped and collapsed again, her strength spent. The cowboy noticed immediately. He turned from the driver and knelt beside her, his massive frame blocking her from the crowd. Up close, he looked even larger, broad shoulders, weathered face, eyes sharp but not cruel. He removed his hat and set it aside, then spoke more softly, though his voice still carried. "Don't try to stand," he said. "You're safe. For now, safe." The word felt foreign, almost dangerous. She blinked up at him, her vision swimming. Dust and blood streaked her face, but she forced herself to stay awake. They said. Her voice failed her. "I know," he replied. He didn't ask what she had done. He didn't ask if she deserved this. That alone nearly broke her. A shout rang out from the crowd. "You can't just interfere. That's justice." The cowboy rose slowly, turning to face the town. He placed himself squarely between them and the woman, his body a living wall. "This," he said, gesturing to the torn rope, the blood in the dirt, the trembling woman behind him, "ain't justice. The sheriff stepped forward then, clearing his throat. "Now see here." The cowboy cut him off with a look. Not anger, disappointment. "You're the law," he said. "Act like it." No one spoke. The cowboy bent again, sliding one arm beneath the woman's shoulders, the other under her knees. She cried out softly as he lifted her, then went still, surprised by the gentleness of his grip. He held her as if she weighed nothing at all. As he turned toward his horse, the crowd parted without a word. Behind them, the wagon stood abandoned, the rope lying useless in the dirt, a broken symbol of a lie that had just been cut in two. The silence did not last. It cracked the moment the cowboy took his first step away from the wagon, the woman held securely against his chest. Whispers flared into angry voices and angry voices into shouts. Fear, once turned inward, now sought a target. "You think you can just take her?" someone yelled. "She's a criminal." Another shouted, louder, as if volume could make it true. The cowboy stopped and turned slowly, careful not to jostle the woman in his arms. His gaze swept the street, over the men clutching their pride, over the women standing stiff with uncertainty, over the sheriff who looked like he wished the ground would open and swallow him. "She hasn't been tried," the cowboy said. "She hasn't been proven guilty. And you dragged her like an animal. That's how things are done here," a man near the saloon barked. He stepped forward, puffing his chest. "You don't like it, you can leave town." The cowboy shifted his stance, angling his body so the woman's head rested safely against his shoulder. Only then did he free one hand, letting it hang near his gun, not touching it, just reminding everyone it was there. "I will leave," he said. "With her." That was when Elias Crow stepped out of the shade. He moved with measured calm, straightening his cuffs as if this were a business dispute instead of a public brutality. His eyes flicked to the woman, taking in her injuries with cool assessment, then to the cowboy. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "You're making a mistake," Crow said. "This woman stole from me." The town agreed on her punishment. The woman stirred at the sound of his voice, her fingers tightening weakly in the cowboy's shirt. He felt it and his jaw set. "Funny thing about agreement," the cowboy replied. "It don't mean much when it's built on a lie." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Crow's smile faded, just slightly. "Careful," Crow warned. "You're accusing a respected man." The cowboy took one slow step forward. The crowd recoiled without realizing it. "I don't care who respects you," he said evenly. "I care what you did." Crow's eyes hardened. "Sheriff," he said, not looking away from the cowboy, "are you going to let this outsider undermine your authority?" All eyes turned to the sheriff. Sweat beaded at his temple. His hand twitched near his badge. For a moment, it looked like he might speak up, might finally do something worthy of the title he wore. Then he looked at Crow and looked away. "She's still under arrest," the sheriff muttered. "You're interfering." The cowboy exhaled slowly through his nose. The disappointment from earlier returned, heavier now. He adjusted his grip on the woman, then lifted his chin. "Anyone who wants to stop me," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the street, "is welcome to try." No one moved, not the men with guns, not the sheriff. Not even Elias Crow, whose confidence finally cracked under the weight of a man who could not be bought or intimidated. The town had made its choice again. This time, not with ropes or wagons, but with cowardice. The cowboy turned away. Behind him, anger simmered, unspent and dangerous. Ahead lay the open road, uncertain and long. But in his arms was a woman still breathing, still alive. And for now, that was enough to make enemies of an entire town. The cowboy didn't mount his horse right away. He carried the woman to the edge of the street first, away from the crowd, away from the saloon windows and the hard watching eyes. He lowered himself carefully, kneeling in the dust, and eased her down against a hitching post. Only when he was certain she was supported did he step back to assess her injuries. She was worse than she looked. Blood had soaked through the torn sleeve at her wrist where the rope had burned deep into the skin. Her knees were raw and swollen, skin split open and packed with grit. One side of her face was already purpling, and every breath she took came shallow, like it hurt to pull air into her lungs. "You with me?" he asked quietly. Her eyelids fluttered. "I think so." The words were barely more than breath. "That's good," he said. "Stay that way." He tore a strip from his own bandana and poured water from his canteen over her wrist, washing away dirt and blood. She hissed in pain, her body tensing, and immediately he slowed, his movements gentle, apologetic. "Easy," he murmured. I know. No one had spoken to her like that all day. A small crowd lingered at a distance, pretending interest in anything but the scene unfolding. The sheriff stood frozen, shame and fear wrestling across his face. Elias Crow had retreated to the boardwalk, his expression unreadable. The cowboy stood and led his horse closer. The animal was a massive bay, calm and steady, lowering its head as if it understood the gravity of the moment. "I'm going to put you up there," the cowboy said, nodding to the saddle. "You can hold on?" She swallowed and nodded once. He slipped one arm around her back and lifted her again, slowly, giving her time to adjust. She clutched his shirt, her fingers weak but determined, and he waited until the shaking in her hands eased before swinging her carefully onto the saddle. When he climbed up behind her, the crowd stirred again. "You can't just take her." Someone shouted, desperation edging the anger now. The cowboy didn't turn. He gathered the reins and nudged his horse forward. "If she's guilty," he said over his shoulder, "you can come prove it. With facts, not ropes." No one followed. The horse stepped into a slow, steady walk, each hoofbeat carrying them farther from the center of town. The woman leaned back against him, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Her head lolled slightly, and he tightened his arm around her waist to keep her upright. "Don't fall asleep yet," he said softly. "I'm trying," she whispered. "Thank you." The word struck him harder than he expected. He hadn't done this for thanks. He'd done it because he couldn't stand by again. Still, he nodded, unable to trust his voice. They passed the last buildings, then the final fence, and the town fell away behind them. Ahead stretched open land, rough and unforgiving, but honest. As the road dipped and rose beneath them, the woman's breathing evened out. She was still hurt, still in danger. But she was no longer alone. And for the first time since the rope tightened around her wrist, she was moving forward by choice, not force. The ranch sat miles from anything that resembled a town. A low, weather-beaten house squatted against the rise of the hills, its boards sun-bleached and scarred by years of wind and storms. A barn leaned slightly to one side, stubborn but standing, and a split-rail fence marked the boundary between the wild land and the life the cowboy had carved from it. No neighbors, no witnesses, just open sky and quiet. The cowboy helped the woman down from the horse as carefully as he had lifted her on. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her, and he steadied her without comment, guiding her inside the house. The interior was simple, clean, but sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a small stove. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was decorative. It was a place built by a man who expected to be alone. He laid her on the bed and lit the lamp. In the softer light, her injuries looked even worse. He set to work without hesitation, fetching clean water, salve, and bandages from a battered wooden chest. "This is going to hurt," he warned. She gave a tired, crooked smile. "It already does." As he cleaned her wounds, she flinched but didn't cry out. He noticed that filed it away quietly. She was stronger than she looked, stronger than most. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the crackle of the stove and the low murmur of his voice when he told her to breathe or warned her before touching a tender spot. When he finished, her wrist was wrapped, her knees bandaged, and her breathing had steadied. "You'll heal," he said. "But you'll need time." She nodded, eyes heavy. "Why did you help me?" He paused, the question landing heavier than any accusation the town had thrown at him. He turned away, busying himself with putting things away. "Because it was wrong," he said finally. She watched him for a long moment. "That's not the whole truth." He exhaled slowly and leaned against the table. "Once," he said, "I saw something like that happen. I didn't step in. I told myself it wasn't my business." His jaw tightened. "I don't make that mistake anymore." The admission hung between them. She turned her face toward the ceiling. "I wouldn't have survived another mile." "I know," he replied. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, carrying the sound of distant coyotes. The isolation pressed in, not frightening, but real. A reminder that whatever came next, they would face it alone. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. She hesitated. Her name belonged to the girl who had been dragged through town, to the lie that still clung to her skin. "I don't know," she said softly. "Not anymore." He studied her, then nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "You can rest here," he said. "As long as you need." Her eyes closed, tears slipping silently into her hair. For the first time in days, sleep claimed her, not the exhausted collapse of defeat, but the fragile beginning of safety. And as the lamp flickered low, the cowboy sat watch beside her, guarding not just a wounded woman, but a truth the world had tried to erase. The knock came just after dawn. It was soft, too soft for trouble, yet the cowboy was awake before it sounded. He had spent the night in the chair by the bed, boots on, rifle within reach. Old habits didn't fade easily. He opened the door to find a boy standing on the porch, no more than 15, hat clutched nervously in his hands. One of the stable hands from town. I was told you might be here," the boy said, glancing past him, eyes flicking toward the bed. "I saw what happened yesterday." The cowboy stepped aside. "Speak your piece," the boy swallowed. "Elias Crow didn't get robbed. I know because I helped him lock his office that night. Nothing was missing." He told the sheriff otherwise the next morning. The words settled like stones. The woman stirred at the sound of voices. She pushed herself up on one elbow, wincing. "He lied," she said, not surprised. "He always lies." The boy nodded quickly. "I tried to tell my pa, but he said to keep quiet. Said Crow would ruin us." The cowboy's expression hardened not with anger, but resolve. "You willing to say that in front of others?" The boy hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Yes, sir." By mid-morning, they were riding back toward town. The woman sat taller in the saddle this time, pain still etched into her movements, but her eyes clear. She wore a clean shirt the cowboy had given her, sleeves rolled carefully over her bandaged wrist. It didn't erase what had happened, but it reminded the town she was still a person. They rode straight down Main Street. The sight of them together, unbroken, sent a ripple through the town. People emerged from doorways, drawn by equal parts curiosity and dread. Elias Crow stood near his office, his face tightening as he saw them approach. The cowboy dismounted and helped the woman down. Then he turned to the gathering crowd. "This town punished an innocent woman," he said, voice steady. "And today you're going to hear why." The boy stepped forward, hand shaking but voice clear. He told them everything about the locked office, the lie, the way Crow had spoken to him afterward. A second voice joined him, then a third, people who had known pieces of the truth but lacked the courage to speak alone. Crow's confidence cracked. He protested, threatened, tried to buy silence the way he always had. But the spell was broken. The sheriff finally looked at the woman not as a criminal, but as proof of his failure. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the lie lay in ruins, and the town could no longer pretend it didn't know the truth. The town square, once a stage for humiliation, became a courtroom without walls. Dust swirled in the midday sun as whispers of the truth spread, louder now, impossible to ignore. The crowd that had gathered for spectacle the day before now watched in tension. unsure how to react to the unraveling of their own complicity. Elias Crow's composure cracked completely. His polished boots scuffed the dirt as he stepped forward, hands raised not in surrender, but in an attempt to regain authority. "This is nonsense." "Lies," he shouted, but the words fell flat. The voices of the witnesses had already taken hold, each recounting the truth they had been too afraid to speak. The cowboy stood beside the woman, calm and immovable. He didn't need a badge, a courtroom, or a jury. His presence alone commanded attention, a wall of silent authority. "No more lies," he said, voice low but carrying over the crowd. "No more fear. You'll face what's right today." Crow sputtered, but the people of the town were already turning their attention toward him. Faces that had been indifferent or fearful yesterday now reflected shame, anger, and a hard-earned resolve. The baker, who had once whispered that the woman deserved her fate, stepped forward. The blacksmith, who had laughed along with others, nodded in agreement. "He lied," the blacksmith said. "All of it." The sheriff, who had frozen in the shadows of his office the day before, finally found his courage. "It's on me," he admitted, raising his hands to the crowd. "I did nothing when I should have acted. The law failed her. It fails us all if we let lies guide it." Crow's attempts at intimidation crumbled as the townspeople confronted him openly. Witnesses provided evidence, letters, receipts, and testimony proving he had fabricated the theft to punish the woman for defying him. The truth was undeniable. "You've ruled through fear for too long," the cowboy said finally, stepping close enough for Crow to feel the weight of his presence. "But fear won't protect you today." Faced with a united town and exposed lies, Crow had no choice but to leave. He packed his belongings under the eyes of the people he had once ruled with influence and threats. His power dissolved in the dust as transient as the winds that swept through Main Street. The woman, her bandages still fresh but her spirit restored, stood in the center of the square. The crowd's attention shifted from Crow to her. For the first time, she was not defined by shame or accusation. She was a survivor, a symbol of resilience, and a living testament that truth and courage could overcome lies and cowardice. The cowboy, ever watchful, stayed beside her. No words were necessary. His presence alone was reassurance. The town had learned its lesson, though the scars of silence and complicity would remain. Justice had been served, not by formal decree, but by courage, truth, and a refusal to turn away from what was right. As the sun dipped lower, the square emptied slowly, leaving only the woman and the cowboy. No applause, no fanfare, just a quiet acknowledgement of the ordeal that had passed. In the frontier, justice wasn't always perfect, but today it had been earned and it had been witnessed. For the first time since her public humiliation, the woman could breathe freely. Her shoulders no longer weighed down by guilt or lies. The town might have once dragged her through the dirt, but now she stood upright, stronger, wiser, and no longer alone. And somewhere deep in her chest, she felt the faint but unmistakable stir of hope for the first time in many long, painful days. The road out of town was quiet. Dust rose behind their horse like a ghost of the day's chaos, carrying with it the echoes of a town that had learned, if only briefly, to confront its own cowardice. The woman rode beside the cowboy, her hands now free of ropes and bindings, her eyes alert, yet softer than they had been for weeks. For the first time, she was moving forward not out of fear, but by choice. When they reached the edge of the cowboy's ranch, the expanse of open land seemed endless. Hills rolled into the distance, dotted with scrub and wildflowers. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass and pine, and the air was thick with the freedom of isolation. Here, no one would judge her. Here, she could be more than the lies that had defined her. Inside the house, the cowboy helped her down from the horse, steadying her as always. He had prepared a small room for her, a clean bed, fresh linens, and a few personal touches, though sparse, that hinted at comfort. She hesitated at the doorway, glancing at the simple furnishings, then at the man who had saved her life. "What now?" she asked quietly. He shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You decide. You've got the rest of your life to figure that out." She considered the question carefully. Her name, the one she had carried through shame and accusation, felt like a weight she no longer wanted to bear. A new name, she realized, would be more than a title. It would be a declaration of survival, of ownership over her own story. "I'll choose one," she said finally, her voice steady. "Something that belongs to me." Days turned into weeks as she recovered. The cowboy gave her space but remained ever watchful, silently teaching her the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to care for the animals, mend fences, and handle chores with a quiet confidence. The land became her sanctuary, each sunrise a promise, each sunset a measure of strength. Slowly, a fragile bond formed between them, built not on romance or obligation, but on trust, respect, and the shared understanding of hardship. She revealed pieces of her past, and he shared the truths he had buried deep beneath years of isolation. In each other, they found a companion who neither judged nor demanded, only supported. One evening, as the sky burned amber and gold, she spoke her new name aloud for the first time. It rolled off her tongue like a declaration, soft but unwavering. The cowboy nodded in acknowledgment, as if to say, "You are free now." Life on the ranch was far from easy. Storms came, animals fell ill, and the work was unending. But each challenge reminded her that she was no longer defined by what others thought, no longer constrained by the lies and fear that had once consumed her. She had a home, she had safety, and she had someone who had shown her, without question, that she was worth protecting. In the quiet of the night, she would sometimes sit on the porch, gazing at the horizon, feeling the vastness of the world and the breath of her own survival. The town that had dragged her through the dirt was far behind, a memory she honored only to remember her strength. The cowboy joined her, silent but present. Together, they watched the stars emerge, distant and unchanging. Life had offered them a second chance, one born from courage, truth, and an unyielding refusal to let cruelty dictate their fate. And in that silence, with the wind carrying the scent of freedom across the ranch, she finally understood. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a woman who had reclaimed her life, her name, and her future. A life of her own making, unfolding one sunrise at a time.